So I was going through my things and I found this book that I had bought that I hadn't apparently taken any time to read yet. And it's called History's Greatest Lies. And on the cover, you have the Emperor Nero, and they've given him a Pinocchio nose. So, as if they're trying to say that Nero was a liar, which is kind of strange given the actual content of the book. Anyway, this book it's not really like an academic sort of book where you have footnotes for sources for every assertion made in the book. You're just supposed to read it and, I guess, trust the author and take it all at face value. But I wanted to share what it says and offer my commentary as we go along. Now, on sources, I ask who provides testimony that Nero helped the citizens of Rome during the Great Fire in 64 AD, because that's one of the most surprising things that in what I'm about to read. And it says that it was Tacitus in his work, the Annals. And then he says that some ancient sources this is Google AI, some ancient sources such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio were more direct in their accusations against Nero, even suggesting he orchestrated the Great Fire in Rome in 64 AD to clear land for his ambitious building projects. But if we look at the lifespans of these three historians, Suetonius was basically born about the time that Nero supposedly committed suicide. Cassius Dio was born in 155 AD, so like who the hell even cares what he says? And Tacitus is the only one who was contemporaneous really to that event, and he may have been about 8 or 9 years old at the time. So that's also from Google AI. So because what I'm about to read calls into question the repeated accusation that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. I asked who first said that Nero fiddled, and Google AI says, while the popular image of Nero fiddling as Rome burned is widely recognized, it's a misconception. No historical evidence supports the claim that Nero played a fiddle during the fire. Now, this book kind of gets hung up on the mention of a fiddle, like saying that a fiddle was anachronistic to Nero's time period. So I wanted to find out whether this accusation was ancient, and if it was ancient, then what word was actually used for the musical instrument that was being played. But apparently there's not much of a mention of a musical instrument. It says the phrase fiddling while Rome burns originated later, with the first known instance of this specific phrasing attributed to George Daniel of Beswick in 1649. While ancient historians like Suetonius and Tacitus mention Nero's actions during the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, none state that he played a fiddle. Tacitus mentions a rumor about Nero singing about the fall of Troy, but not playing an instrument. The fiddle analogy, the association of Nero with fiddling, likely stems from a combination of factors. The idea that he was an irresponsible and self-absorbed ruler, my voice is already getting scratchy, and the later interpretation of the Latin word vitula, which meant to dance around lively or to rejoice as referring to playing the fiddle. George Daniel, a royalist poet, is credited with first using the phrase "let Nero fiddle out Rome's obsequies." In his writings, this specific phrasing solidified the connection between Nero and fiddling during the fire in popular culture. So back to this. So this is in chapter 1 of the book. Did Emperor Nero fiddle as Rome burned? In the you know what? I'm gonna skip I think most of the content because it is copyrighted. And I want to just get to the part where the fire is happening, and then Nero starts helping the people, because this is the unexpected part. Says the chaos was greatest in Subura, Rome's poorest and most densely populated district. Subura's squalid, rickety tenement buildings and makeshift shelters provided more fuel for the fire. Everywhere, people were running, screaming, and crying. In the pandemonium, many were trampled to death. Some committed suicide by jumping into the fire. Now, if you've read about the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of, or the fire that burned the temple down in Jerusalem, you might recall people jumping. I think there were possibly priests of the temple jumping into the fire. Now this provides a possible connection between the fire in Rome and the destruction of Jerusalem and the burning down of the temple in Jerusalem, conducted by the Romans. Now, these historians mentioned, at least one of them, I guess, says that it was the Christians who set fire to Rome. The accusation was made that the Christians set fire to Rome. But lots of scholars say that they don't even think that Romans were capable of differentiating between Jews and Christians at that point in history. Personally, I don't even believe that there were Jesus follower Christians in 64 AD. I don't believe Christianity even existed at that point. I believe that there may have been a religious sect called Christians, who had nothing to do with, the Jesus of the Gospels, and that maybe these Christians got morphed into Christians later on. But so some scholars say that maybe because Rome couldn't tell the difference between the Jewish religion out of Galilee or Judea and the Christian religion out of Galilee or Judea, that maybe it was Jews who were accused of setting fire to Rome. And that would seem to be a lot more historically consistent with Gentile perceptions of Jews than towards Christians. And then it would also provide a motivation to visit revenge upon Jerusalem for the fire in Rome. So, Rome was a city of immigrants, and the foreigners struggled to communicate with one another, almost like Babel after the destruction happened, to the confounding of the languages. A cacophony of wailing women, crying babies, squealing animals, and voices shouting in a dozen different languages rang out in the streets. The deafening sound of buildings crashing to the ground only added to the terrible babel. Half a century earlier, Augustus Caesar had decreed that buildings should not exceed 70 feet. Rome had been smaller and more compact during his reign. Since then, there had been a constant influx of foreigners, Greeks, Arabs, Levantines, Africans, and Asians, and Augustus's decree had been long forgotten. As the population swelled to more than 1 million, greedy patrician landowners erected 7- and 8-story buildings to house the newcomers. The buildings were eyesores. They were too tall, poorly constructed, and lacked basic amenities like running water. Their close proximity was stifling, and fire traveled quickly from one structure to another. These ramshackle buildings could not withstand the fire that raged through Rome. Every few minutes another fell, offering aid amid the ashes. Back in Anzio, a second and then a third messenger arrived with terrible news. All of Rome was burning. Realizing the enormity of the situation, Nero gathered a contingent of guards, and along with his prefect Tigellinus and secretary Epaphroditus, mentioned in the New Testament, by the way, though because of the timeline disparity, based on conventional datings of Pauline epistles, they say, oh, well, this is like some other Epaphroditus, even though this Epaphroditus mentioned in the New Testament is mentioned along with Caesar's household. So it says Nero and Tigellinus and Epaphroditus set off on horseback for Rome. They traveled throughout the night, stopping, and by the way, like the accepted Pauline epistles, I noticed that their dating coincides with the political career of Nero. They traveled throughout the night, stopping only briefly for the men and horses to quench their thirst. The party rode into what was left of Rome. Nero was astounded by the devastation. The air was thick and black with smoke. It stung the men's eyes and filled their lungs. I'm not sure how much of this is dramatic embellishment or how much of it actually comes from Tacitus. Hot embers drifted in the wind, landing on the men and spooking the horses. Stung by the embers and disoriented by the smoke, the horses whinnied and stood firm, refusing to enter the city any further. Everywhere there was destruction. Buildings had been reduced to rubble, and the sickening smell of burning flesh wafted through the streets. Thieves plundered the abandoned shops and residences. Nero was heartsick but determined to take control of the situation. He ordered his men to put out the fires. Coughing and rubbing their eyes, the men made their way through the city. Speckled with soot, The emperor's famous bronze hair appeared black. In the thick smoke he was virtually unrecognizable. Nero dashed from street to street, assisting the injured, offering aid, and even entering a burning building to help rescue a family. A man who did not recognize the emperor was so grateful for his help that he offered him a reward of gold coins. Nero declined the reward and revealed his identity to the startled man. Day after day, unescorted by his guards, Nero returned to the decimated districts. He joined the searches for the missing, transported the newly homeless out of the city, and provided food and shelter. He opened his imperial gardens on the other side of the city to the refugees. He reassured the people, his people, that he would take care of them, and he promised to rebuild Rome. Nero had long desired to build the city anew, but the Senate, whose members owned and leased the tenements and buildings that crowded Rome, had prevented him from doing so. The wealthy landlords feared the construction would cost them money. The emperor might expect them to finance part of the project. Many were also superstitious about replacing structures that had been built by their ancestors. Now at last the emperor had the chance to reshape Rome into a beautiful cosmopolitan metropolis. He cried for Rome, but he also realized the fire presented him with a golden opportunity. Rome, like a phoenix, would rise again, only better than before. Nero and his court took up residence in his pavilion across the Tiber River. It was there that Tigellinus, his closest advisor, suggested that the emperor compose a song to memorialize the sad occasion. The idea of creating a tragic masterpiece appealed to Nero's vanity. Lyre in hand, Nero stood on his terrace and gazed down at the rubble that was Rome. He plucked at the strings of the lyre and improvised a funeral dirge for the city. Nero's heart was heavy, and after a few minutes he set down the lyre and returned inside. So I'm not sure what the source is for that lyre, whether it's Tacitus. He had been on the terrace for a short time, but it was long enough for the people below to hear him sing. Soon an ugly rumor spread that the emperor had set the fire so that he might have a dramatic backdrop for his singing. The fire lasted for 9 days and razed 70% of the city. 4 of the 14 Roman districts survived intact. Hundreds of people died. Most of the city's beloved monuments had been destroyed, including the House of Passage, erected by Nero's uncle Caligula, the shrine to Romulus, the altar dedicated to Hercules, and the ancient palace of King Numa. The fire had also ravaged the imperial palace. Nero was distraught over the loss of his treasured art collection, paintings, statues, and books from around the world that his agents had purchased or pilfered on his behalf. Members of Nero's inner circle suspected that he, an avowed aesthete, like someone who appreciates the aesthetics of a thing, and self-proclaimed virtuoso performer, was more upset over the loss of his collection than the devastation of the city. The emperor devoted himself to drawing up plans for a new Rome. And, let's see. It says, during the construction, Nero housed the refugees in the Pantheon and other public buildings that had survived the fire. Temporary shelters erected in the emperor's private garden provided additional lodging. Wine, food, and clothing brought in from nearby towns were distributed to the refugees. But homeless and restless, the refugees soon became disgruntled and directed their anger at the emperor. They whispered that it was Nero himself who had set the fire. Some people speculated that the theatrical emperor had wanted to sing to the accompaniment of fire. They recounted and embellished the story of Nero standing on the terrace and singing as Rome burned in the distance. Let's see. Others attributed Nero's alleged arson to his desire to rebuild Rome. It was no secret that the Senate had vetoed his plans for renovating the city. The rumor mongers insisted that the emperor had his men burn Rome to the ground so that he could erect his dream city, Neropolis, as in the city of Nero. The rumors spread like the wildfire that had inspired them. So yeah, it says much of what we know about the Great Fire comes from the ancient Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, and their writings exhibit a clear bias against Nero. Tacitus was just 9 years old when the fire broke out. His memories of the incident were likely colored over time. Suetonius was born several years after the fire. Both historians' accounts of the catastrophic event are based almost entirely on second-hand information and reflect public opinion of Nero at that time, which public opinion of Nero at that time would have been very negative because of the declaration of Nero as a public enemy and then the process of damnatio memoriae after his supposed death. Fierce critics of the emperor, the men downplayed his good deeds, accusing him of arson and callously singing while his city burned. Nero's enduring bad reputation can be traced back to this early negative press. There are reliable accounts of Nero singing and plucking at the strings of a lyre while taking a break from fighting the fire. Such accounts continue to eclipse those of the emperor's heroic efforts to quell the flame and comfort the populace. So then as for support of Nero's being guilty about the fire, it goes on to talk about like lots of crimes that Nero had committed in the past. So here's a section on Christian scapegoats. It was inevitable that the rumors blaming him for the fire would reach the emperor. Nero had an almost pathological need for popularity, and the rumors deeply upset him. He wondered whether the fire had been an accident or an act of arson, and if the fire had been set deliberately, who were the culprits. It was Tigellinus who suggested that the Christians, a strange sect that believed in one God and preached equality for all men, were responsible. In Rome, many people complained that the sect had refused to help put out the fire. Led by Paul of Tarsus, the Christians counted mostly slaves, foreigners, and lower-class freedmen as their members. Now, I'm not sure what the source is for this, unless it's the Acts of Paul and Thecla. The sect was highly critical of the emperor and of Rome, which it viewed as a second Babylon. That may have come later under Domitian. Members of the sect routinely disseminated, because I'm not sure that there really was like a stigma on Babylon earlier in the 1st century. like especially with Christians, maybe with Jews who would know Babylon to be a place of their captivity for until they were liberated by Cyrus the Great of Persia. Members of the sect routinely disseminated anti-Roman texts and propaganda throughout the city. Really? Christians did that? Or were they just accused of doing that? The Romans, like the Greeks, were pagans believing in many gods, gods that the Christians who prayed to a single god denounced. Tolerance reigned in the multicultural metropolis, with differences in race and creed mattering less than social class. However, the Christians aroused feelings of distrust and hostility in their neighbors. That's kind of more true of Jews throughout history, isn't it? Their monotheism and refusal to worship the emperor caused tensions in the city. That might also describe Jews. Widely despised, they were considered rabble-rousers who aimed to disrupt the Roman way of life. Historian Suetonius later described them as an uncouth, uncomfortable set of killjoys, hating the normal pleasures of life and denying the people's gods. That sounds like something that might have described Jews from the Gentile perspective. Eager to exonerate himself, Nero ordered an investigation into the fire. The Christians were targeted as likely arson suspects. Dozens of witnesses came forward to report that the sect had not... See, this is more fitting for Domitian's time period. There just wasn't really that kind of anti-Christian sentiment that early on, in my opinion, because Christians didn't exist yet, but also because of the close proximity in time to the events of the Gospels. And I really don't think that Christianity could have made such a big splash in that amount of time. Dozens of witnesses came forward to report that the sect had not only declined to join the firefighting efforts, but that its members had seemed to welcome the fire. Witnesses said that some Christians, overcome by rapture, emotional rapture in this case, had raised their hands toward the sky and openly rejoiced. They believed that the fire heralded the end of days. I don't know where all this information is coming from, what the source is for this. Their Savior, the Galilean Jesus, had prophesied a judgment day would come during which all men would be held to account for their sins. As the fire raged, some members of the sect waited anxiously for the skies to open and Jesus to emerge and lead them to heaven. This is all descriptive of Christianity's eschatological worldview, and whereas Judaism is a lifestyle. It's not a death style, it's a lifestyle. Paul and another Christian leader named Mark had urged their followers to fight the fire and assist the injured. What I don't know what the source is for this, unless it's the Acts of Paul and Thecla or church tradition. I don't know what the source is for this. But another arm of the sect, led by a man called Hillel, stubbornly refused to help in any way. Now, Hillel's a name you would more expect to be found in the Jewish community. But during the trial, Hillel said that Jesus had caused the fire and that the end of Rome was near. He cursed the city and its people, heathens whom he said deserved to die. That doesn't sound very Jewish. His words caused an uproar. Found guilty of arson and declared enemies of Rome, the Christians were promptly sentenced to death. Supposedly nearly 1,000 Christians were executed. Their deaths made into entertainment. Many were appalled at Nero's savagery and cruelty. His efforts to ingratiate himself with his public backfired. Nero, however, was too busy to notice. See, this just all seems anachronistic. Like, if something like this had really happened, I think that there would have been a lot more said about it in Flavius Josephus. So we'll stop there. So you can read the whole treatment of the subject in this book, but I always prefer to go to the sources when possible and come to my own conclusions, because sometimes there are things that are being, if you read critically, there are things that are being communicated there kind of in a veiled way or in an encoded way. And anyway, I'm not buying all this baloney about Christians setting fire to Rome, or even that they were accused of setting fire to Rome. This is something that later historians could say after Christianity was created by the Roman Flavians, who succeeded, not immediately, but who succeeded Nero. There's just like no mention of any. There's not enough mention. There's the Testimonium Flavianum in Flavius Josephus, which it's got its own problems, but there's really not enough mention in Flavius Josephus about Christians, especially when Josephus makes a point to identify the different sects of Judaism that he believed existed at the time. And then he yet doesn't make any effort to go on about the existence of a Christian sect that supposedly arose from Galilee and Judea. In the decades before the Roman war with the Jews that led to the destruction of the temple, it just doesn't wash. And the thing is, like, the accusation against the Christians setting fire to Rome is one of the reasons that Google AI says that the Caesar's Messiah thesis is implausible. And the other one is the dating of the Pauline epistles going back before the destruction of Jerusalem. And I've looked into the datings of these Pauline epistles and the reasoning behind the datings of these Pauline epistles. And more often than not, scholars date these Pauline epistles to those early dates because of what the Book of Acts reports. But then they date the Book of Acts to like around 100 AD. It's just all daft, man. The more you look into all of this evidence supporting the historicity of Christianity, the more it all evaporates. The more you look into the narrative about the Emperor Nero, the more it evaporates. When you really drill down to the details, it just all it's just a wisp on the wind. It's just a vapor. There's nothing there. And it's just people repeating what other people have said. Just like the accusation that, you know, Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Um, if Nero really engaged in all of those relief efforts that he did during the fire, that that doesn't really sound like a photo op, like you would accuse one of today's politicians of engaging in. Like, if the guy was really getting sooty and dirty and helping different people and day after day, you know, helping and getting in there and getting, you know, rolling his sleeves up and getting dirty, it just that doesn't sound like a photo op. Of course, I guess you didn't have photos back then, so in order to engage in a photo op back then, you would actually have to be seen by people, and that would take time and days of effort. But it seems like an awful lot of effort for someone who could just have other people do it. And it more seems to describe the effort of a man maybe who was influenced by Judaism, as Flavius Josephus reports, and who was trying to behave like a Hasid, a merciful, graceful person, so that it's possible that Nero had really turned over a new leaf, especially maybe if the accusations about crimes he committed earlier in his life were true, then maybe he had a lot to repent for, and maybe he lived in such a way to do so. And then maybe that's what led to his conversion to Judaism, and then his eventual self-exile from Rome just to preserve his own life. Of course, if Nero converted to Judaism, the Romans would have seen that as a betrayal, especially after the Great Fire of Rome. So that might be why, and his Nero's possible presence in Jerusalem may have been part of what prompted the orders that supposedly came from Nero himself, but that sent the Roman Flavians, Vespasian and his son Titus, to make war in Galilee and Judea, and to lay siege to Jerusalem and to destroy the temple. I think that there were hard, concrete reasons for this turning point in first century history that was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. I don't think it was just because of Jesus supposedly uttered the little apocalypse in Matthew 24, I think it was, and then that's the reason, because the Jews rejected Jesus, right? No, I think that there were more historical reasons and motivations behind what was done. but that they've been obscured by this Christian mythology. So, anyway, I'll stop there.